Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. I'm your host, Al Horner, and I'm a man of the belief that any movie in which Cate Blanchett screams at her neighbours while aggressively playing the accordion, well, that's a film worth talking about. Which is why I'm so excited that this week we're joined by writer-director Todd Field, whose incredible new film Tar has really burrowed its way into my subconscious. Recently nominated for just about every award going, it's an up-close portrait of a prodigious but problematic classical pianist named Lydia Tar, played by Blanchett. Tar's achievements as the first female conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic are blighted by a history of sexual misconduct allegations, now threatening to unravel her life, her marriage, and her mental health. Lydia's abuses of power in this tense sensory drama have seen the film become a lightning rod for conversations around so-called cancel culture. But as you'll discover in this episode, Tar actually began life long before that term had even been coined. There are deeply human questions of power, corrosion, and culpability within this story that do dovetail in an interesting way with our current climate, but ultimately are bigger than that buzzword and the volatile conversation around it. I really can't recommend the film enough, nor describe how glad I was that Todd was able to spare the time to come on the show and break down some of its themes, scenes, and characters in fascinating detail. Is Lydia really being haunted? What was the early incarnation of the film like before the project was rooted in the high-stakes world of classical music? And when the film ends with a reference to a video game named Monster Hunter, how accurate is it to interpret that this has been a narrative about falling from grace, the titular monster finally hunted? I spent 45 really compelling minutes with Todd finding out. Thanks to him, and a huge thank you as ever to our supporters on Patreon who helped make this episode possible. Script Apart is produced by two people and two people alone, me and my producer Cam. So your support on Patreon is immensely valuable. It helps us continue to create episodes and continue to expand. So thank you if you're already a supporter. If you're not, but are thinking, hey, maybe I'd like to be, head to patreon.com/scriptapart to get involved. Okay, that's the overture out of the way. Let's hand it over to the maestro himself, Todd Field, discussing the first draft secrets of Tar. Thanks for tuning in, guys. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Hey Todd, so great to have you with us. You began work on Tar a decade ago. At least, that's when the character first appeared to you, as you've described it elsewhere. Can you tell me about your first encounter with Lydia as this character who kind of popped into your head one day? I'd be really curious to know, who she was at that point and what you think it was about that moment, either in your life or in the culture, that prompted her to leap out of your subconscious.
I've been thinking of a lot about what was becoming finally as sort of apparent and beginning to surface publicly about patriarchal abuse of power, historic abuse of power, power that we were all born and raised into. And suddenly people were finally beginning to talk about it in the media, and it begged a question, which is, okay, we all, in our whatever our various disciplines or lines of work are, we've all encountered sort of the sort of complicity of power, because that's an agreement. That's an agreement between people of sort of allowing and ignoring and doing things because there's a cost benefit. And I reckon, at that point I had been in my industry for many, many years, a couple of decades, and I'd certainly witnessed those sorts of things. And so when I started thinking about this character, I thought, well, we don't see this with women. We don't see this very often with people of color. We don't see this with people that have been marginalized to the edge of society by that patriarchal power. So wouldn't that be an interesting way to actually look at how power is a phenomenon, or as a force, or as a one of the deadly sins, how it actually operates? Because were this character a white male, I think it would be very hard to get to that point where you're actually looking at the thing itself, power, because we all have very conditioned responses to what it means to have it be a white male, because we've experienced and heard about this all too often, you know. But I really thought that character would really just end up living in a notebook forever and ever, and she did, you know, because for the next 10 years and the 10 years previous, uh, you know, if I was fortunate enough to be on a writing assignment, it was based on adapting other people's material, and a lot of times I worked alongside those writers, and that was a huge privilege. But I was also like openly envious of my colleagues because they were fiction writers, and they got to sit down and break the ground first, and that was something I wondered about because I hadn't done it since film school, you know, and I the idea that I would ever have like a 4-month ramp to write a spec script. I never had that much time because I never had that much money in the bank, and I have a large family and not a very large bank account. So when at the beginning of the pandemic, when the studio said you can write whatever you like, you know, no outline, no pitch, nothing, um, and we were all wondering if we were going to survive and what the world would look like, you know, after this detonation had gone off. And would there be cinemas? Would there be churches? Would there be public swimming pools? Would there be any place where we'd be allowed to gather again collectively? No one knew the answer to that. So it was a very strange sort of situation to sit down at a desk every day and think, you know, what shall I write? And so I started looking through my notebooks, and there she was, you know, and I thought, okay, this is it. These are the questions to sort of maybe deal with, because they're questions that I'd had for a very, very long time. Like, you know, the old saw, like, you know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And why is that, you know, and is there any escape from that? So, I mean, that's really kind of, that's really sort of how the script began.
That's interesting. And was there a mission statement from the beginning to kind of go about this story without judgment of this character? The film kind of extends compassion without absolution to Lydia for her behavior. I'd be really curious to know whether that was something by design. It seems important to the story and to your film that the approach was one of balance, of empathy without letting the protagonist off the hook.
Well, she was a very real person to me, you know, so the rules were really more about when do we meet her in her life. And I'd certainly written her entire backstory from the time she was a child. So I probably had an implicit empathy with the child in her, the reasons that she found salvation in music in the first place. Children are, well, most children are perfect, you know, at some point until that changes, the world changes or their situation changes or something beyond their control. External forces happen, or internal forces, chemical things, whatever. But the idea that, you know, that we're all born innocent into the world. So I tried to look at her as objectively as much as one possibly could, if you're writing a character, without coming down on one side or the other. It was just the facts, just reportage in terms of a for the most part, you know, a fairly objective point of view that has a fairly close proximity to her. The rules were simple, that we only know what she knows. We don't know for certainty what happened before these 3 weeks. And we don't know what's happening in the future, and we're allowed access to her present moment, a couple of private moments, an omnipotent moment of someone watching her at the very beginning through a device, and seeing her through the eyes of two other characters, one Francesca Lentini, played by Noemi Merlant, and the other, of course, by Sharon Goodnow, her wife, played by Nina Haas, and then the tiniest bit of perhaps interior haunting or manifestation or whatever it is that she's experiencing in brief. But for the most part, it's a fairly arm's length, objective examination of this character.
There must have been some details from that extensive backstory that you mentioned writing that it was quite painful to cut, or you toyed with including somewhere, but ultimately decided this would be too much of a digression. This would be too much of a detour. I am curious though, Todd. Like, was there anything that you considered including in the script from that material that I understand was largely written to inform your read of the character, your understanding of who Lydia is? Was there anything that almost made the cut?
No, I'm not a backstory guy. I'm not really a plotter. I'm a character man. I admire people that are plotters and construction people. I don't really work that way. The scaffolding for me normally is based upon again the sort of construction of others, fiction writers and things like that. In this case, I really sat down because I honestly didn't believe anyone would ever make this film. I mean, I was shocked that they said they wanted to make it. And
You can tell on the first page.
yeah, I really kind of just sat down and wrote this like a piece of fiction, and it I there was really no consequence other than that the world was, upside down and it was scary. So like I said, there were really simple rules for me and I didn't think very much about it. They just seemed right for her. Again, it was about trying to ask some questions um, of myself as a writer, and backstory in such a situation, I think would be at odds with trying to do that. Because if you're getting in late and you're getting out early kind of thing with her, you're playing catch up from the beginning, and the game's afoot. That's part of the if there is a level of engagement, or dare I say pleasure, in catching up with this character, it's because there is no backstory, you know.
And was the character always called Lydia Tar? Because, well, there's something so perfect about the name. That surname evokes ideas of being kind of tarred and feathered, which is a phrase appropriate to the kind of cancel culture explorations of the film. The stickiness and toxicity of that substance, tar, also, you can sink in it, and there's a sinking feeling to this movie. Was that a happy accident? Was that by design? Talk me through it.
Well, again, I haven't had unfortunately, my Jungian analyst retired about 20 years ago. I really miss him. But I do feel like it being in dialogue with a skilled practitioner such as he was or is, wherever he is. Yeah, I don't, I didn't, it wasn't by design, you know. And who can say what's an accident and who can say what's, coming from your subconscious. But I just wrote that name down. That was the name I wrote in the book. I didn't think about it. It wasn't like I wasn't consciously thinking about. It was a musical name, you know. Um, it's a very musical name when you say it. It's like da 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 Lydia Tar. It's not like. And there's certainly some Hungarian artists, both filmmakers and a very famous filmmaker, Béla Tar, who had been someone that I'd certainly studied and gone to school on, and was a great admirer of all of his work. There was a great novelist by the last name of Tar from Hungary that I liked very much, and so maybe that's where it came from, but I don't know. It was a name I wrote down. It was a name when I started the script that I put on a chalkboard with a circle around it, and it became the hub for this thing. It started to turn into other things as the writing happened, but that was just by experimentation, you know.
And what were some of the other kind of initial ideas that you were scribbling down at that moment? Like, I understand that she wasn't always a conductor, so I'd be really curious to know, like, what your initial vision for the character was, how you came to center her in the world of classical music and conducting.
When I first thought about her, when I first made a few notes in a small notebook, I think at the time I had her sitting atop a media company. But that was just a placeholder. I mean, she could have been sitting across any kind of multinational energy company, or a banking consortium, or anything like that. The one thing that when the studio called me up and said, "Would you ever be interested in writing something about classical music or a conductor?" I thought, you know, that was really the only conversation that we had, and I said, "Okay, sure." Yeah, I know a little bit about that. I'd done a piece of writing as a writing assignment, you know, 15 years before that, for something that I wasn't going to direct, and so I kind of dipped my toe in there. If you're dealing with power, you're talking about, the shape of a pyramid, and so what better than an orchestra, right? I mean, you've got it's a triangle, literally, with with a very clear, top, which is the fulcrum, which is the podium. So I said, sure, so that was a very easy thing to say, okay, what am I writing? And who is this person? And there she was.
And by the time you sat down and wrote the first draft at the top of the pandemic, Todd, did you have the movie as it is today pretty much mapped out? Like, were there story avenues you were still exploring at that time that, ultimately turned out to be dead ends, but, in your first draft stage, you were still exploring? I'd be really interested to hear what, if anything, changed as presumably you took an initial pass at the script and then, rewrote it some more.
Well, this was a very unusual situation, Al. The script I handed in, they gave me no notes. That was the script that was greenlit. So that was the shooting script. I never rewrote anything.
Wow.
The only thing that, but I would also say that, I'm a firm believer, and I think this is hard if you write material that you're not directing, that you're not producing, that you're not editing. And this is where I think it's a bum deal for writers often. My father-in-law is the great screenwriter Bo Goldman, and
Yeah,
Bo
yeah.
never directed. He would have been a wonderful director, and I know that from working with him on material when I was a young actor. But you're at the mercy of whoever is out shooting your stuff. But when you're shooting your stuff, you're at no one's mercy because you're still writing. If you're on the set and you say, wait a minute, we're shooting scene 65 and it sure smells like scene 42, we need to do something differently. You might end up completely inverting a scene to have it mean something 180 degrees different. So there's some contrast. So you're finding something else. So you really, the old cliche is that the final draft is in the edit is absolutely true. And it was interesting with this film for me because you know, I I kind of have a film family, and that's funny to say for somebody that's only made a couple of features. But most of the people that I worked with on those features were people that I had worked with since film school, including my script supervisors. So in this case, there were a couple of mandates from the studio. One was that I was the only American, and then I had to work with an all German crew. Well, other than my first AD, who's a incredible collaborator and someone that I've worked in advertising with over the years. So I knew each other. We knew each other well. I hadn't worked with anyone else. And the script supervisor used to come to me and say, "You're changing this. You can't do that. It's in the script. It says this." And I said, well, Todd wrote the script, not God. And you're talking to Todd, and we're still writing the script. It's okay. We can change it. No one's going to throw us into movie jail. So the revision process was really done as it always is when you're making something that you've written, which is through process. Very much like the film. The film is a process film. It's not a performance film. So that comes out of rehearsals, and that comes out of trying things that feel like they might be better done another way. That comes through when you're sitting in an editing room with somebody as talented as Monica Willie, and you say, "Why are they talking so much? Who wrote this? Where's the dumb writer so I can punch him?" And I was like, "Oh, it's me." Um, do we really need this scene here? Would it be better if we get rid of it? All of those typical things that normally you would do if you were going through 4 or 5 sets of revision on a script.
Well, I'd love to dive into some scenes with you, Todd. There's an obvious kind of exposition reason to start your movie the way you do, with Lydia kind of taking part in this Q&A in front of a huge audience. The interviewer, in his introduction before Lydia comes out on stage, he's able to tell us in the audience who the character is in a way that feels organic to the world on screen. Was that the sole impulse behind starting your film with this incredible scene? And were there ever any other kind of places you contemplated beginning this story?
No, I always saw it that way. I mean, the first time we meet her, we're meeting her through the eyes or through the device of someone else. And she's vulnerable. She's observed. She literally is blindfolded, like she's about ready to go and be executed. All you'd have to do is put a cigarette in her mouth. So that's our first view of her. our second view of her is more objective. We're in front of her and we're alone with her, and she's very bothered and clearly on high alert, very anxious, one might say frightened. So again, very, very vulnerable character. Now the contrast between those two meetings is her walking on stage and performing, and that's a performance. She's performing Lydia Tar. She is not Lydia Tar. It's a character that she's self-constructed, and that goes along with that biography. And that biography has very clearly been constructed by her, because you see her assistant Francesca Lentini mouthing it word for word. So
That's
Adam
right.
Gopnik is dutifully trotting that out, word for word, syllable for syllable. So, the first time we meet her, we have access we don't understand through whoever this person is on the other side of the device, then access that is where we're so close to her it may be uncomfortable, and then we're at arm's length, and we see her as the world sees her. And so I always saw it that way. I always thought that was a good way to meet her, and then to keep her at arm's length through different sorts of facets of her world, until we finally find her in a way that we have understandable sort of access to her. When she's literally when she's brushing her teeth in the morning, and you go, oh, okay, great, yeah, okay, now how thrilling it is to see her do something so so everyday, so commonplace, right? But in terms of, yes, it's in terms of her, in terms of being able to get her backstory and be able to understand a milieu that perhaps many people heretofore have had no exposure to or interest in. Obviously that was a very handy thing to do, because the main thing is we understand this, that she is an expert in her field, that she knows her stuff. Not that we know it, but that we know she knows it, so that by the end of that New Yorker talk, you're no longer watching anybody but Lydia Tar playing Lydia Tar.
There are so many things happening in that scene. It establishes the reverence with which she's regarded, the height from which she has to tumble over the course of this movie. It also establishes a bit of a ticking clock as the movie begins to hurtle towards the deadlines involved in this live recording of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. There's also the mystery of this red-headed woman that we see at the back of the auditorium. This we kind of later come to understand is Krista, a past student. And that strand of the film is so fascinating. And I'm particularly fascinated by the way you lean in formally to the story you're telling there. Like, her death in this movie haunts Lydia, and both on the page and in your direction, you approach it as a haunting. Like, there are chunks of this film that you present like a ghost story, Todd. The motif, for example, of bumps in the night waking Lydia up, kind of causing her to go wandering through her apartment. Can you tell me about the inspiration behind this whole side of the film, and the degree to which I'm right or wrong in thinking there is a ghost story component to this movie, the ghosts of Lydia's past behavior kind of rendered physical in those horror movie scenes?
Well, I mean, she is being haunted. I remember when we had the first time we shown the film, the very first press conference in Venice, there was a reporter from Boston who asked if it was a haunting, and I think I dropped the ball that was thrown to me, because of course there is, uh, but I don't really think about it in a genre way,
Yeah.
and that's not really where it came from. I mean, I think, as you say, her deeds, or the ghosts from the past, are she's faded. They're catching up with her, and she can feel that, and the very first kind of moment of that is, about close to, 40 some odd minutes into the film, when she's brushing her hair at the Carlisle Hotel, and she turns as if there's something on her back. She's bothered, and from that moment on, it's like there's something on her she can't get off of herself, you know. So there's something that is there's something niggling at her, and whether or not that is real, whatever that means, or it's something that's manifesting from her, from somewhere within her. is kind of irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. That's really up for the viewer. But there is something that's bothering her. That's something inevitable. Um,
And the scene where Lydia has a conversation with a pangender student who kind of struggles to engage with Bach's music because of what he perceives as the composer's misogynistic life away from the podium. I felt my entire screening kind of leaning forward in that scene, the entire audience. It's such a compelling and intriguing exchange of ideas, Todd. You mentioned earlier about like some scenes in this film being kind of an outlet for questions and debates you were having within yourself. Is this one such scene? I'd love to know about your relationship with some of the questions being asked on both sides in this segment of the movie, Todd.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's the first scene that I wrote, and I rewrote it for months. Every day at the end of my writing day for the rest of the script, I'd go back to that scene. And yeah, I mean that scene was important to me because it's a scene about the questions. I mean, quite literally, she's laying the theme out for this other character at the piano. Um, Now, in terms of the characters, and that's really the only thing that I could speak to. I think the desire to write the scene in the first place was sort of like the age-old question, which is the 50-year-old person. Somebody saying, if you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say? Would you have any wisdom to impart? And that's a very dodgy proposition. Uh,
Yeah.
and and in this case, you have a character who's middle-aged, um, who, not that there'll be a test, but if you've been listening carefully, at the age that this student was this student.
Yeah, yeah.
She graduated from Harvard. She went to the Amazon. She turned her back on canonical works. She wasn't interested in playing dead white man music. She was with people of color, and she was trying to get at the source of where does music come from. Her PhD was on ethnomusicology rather, was in studying this, the Icaros of the Eastern Amazon with the Shipibo Kanibo people. So she's she is the student. There's no difference. It's like if you got in a time machine, she would be the student in this instance.
Mm.
So where does the scene begin? The scene begins with her insulting the student on their choice of Anna Thorvald's Row, which is an incredible piece of music. Personally, that's my position on it. And Anna was kind enough and had enough awareness of pretend, and that this was a character and wasn't a fact or any piece of editorializing on any of the filmmaker's part, to allow us to use the music and to actually allow what Lydia Tar says about her music to be in the film. So that was a beautiful thing, right?
Yeah.
Because why is Lydia Tar tearing down Anna Thorvald's piece? Well, we don't know this yet, but in the scene that follows this directly, we see that she's in the midst of trying to write something herself, right? And when her assistant comes in, she says, I don't know, it all sounds like, yeah, it doesn't sound uh, like, Charles, warmed over Charles Ives. Well, Charles Ives, is sort of one of the great parents of atonal music. But here she is ripping down Anna Thorvald's music to the student because it's atonal. And because it has, she professes that it has no intent or point of view. But she also goes on to talk about Anna Thorvald's and objectify her physically. She talks about her beauty, right, and her age, that she's young, and 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 Lydia Tar isn't young; she's middle aged. She struggles with writing something that she's already characterized as being atonal, that she never gets very far with through the entire movie. So she's got a bone to pick with this student. It's not coming from left field. I think it's interesting to see how people read the scene, because there is also the argument of the student's dismissal of Bach, but I think the more important dismissal is the first one by her. She's holding power in that scene. She has it over this kid who's in a very vulnerable position, and clearly is affable enough to laugh at her jokes and allow her to put him in an even more vulnerable position for a very long time, and he's clearly nervous, you know? He's embracing the idea of surrendering himself to what she has to say until it's too much and he can't do it anymore. So they both have their reasons and they both have their arguments, and they both articulate those arguments. But I think he's a much more honest about articulating his viewpoint about Bach, whether you believe it or not, you know, whether you agree with him or not. He's been completely transparent about what his reasons are. Lydia Tar isn't being transparent at all.
I'm really intrigued by the juxtaposition of how, for example, you followed that scene with different scenes in which kind of we're slaloming in terms of our perception of the character and our empathy as an audience towards her. Lydia contains multitudes, and the film presents these many different glimpses of those multitudes, both good and bad, in ways that keep our feeling towards her in this constant state of fluidity. Sometimes there's courage and even hilarity, I think, to her behavior. Like, I know I probably shouldn't laugh at a grown woman telling a small kid that she's going to get her if she continues bullying her child, but that's who I am, apparently. Then moments later in the script, Lydia will be quite mean to her assistant, or she'll make some other transgression that makes it really hard to like her. Can you talk to me about your attentiveness to the ordering of these moments in order to kind of engineer that moral slipperiness? Did it come about organically, or was there a method to the way that almost scene to scene, the audience is being forced to reevaluate how they feel about her?
I don't think it was very conscious. Again, I think that if anyone were to follow any of us around for 3 weeks, we're by definition we are a jumble of contradictions. We're faithful, we're unfaithful, uh, we have integrity, we're hypocrites, we're capricious or we're precise, and all of us are. I mean, that's by definition human, right? None of us are absolute sinners or saints. So it's really about just trying to see as many aspects of this character as a human being as possible, you know, um, to try to hopefully have her be as three-dimensional as possible. And this was like sitting down and writing a piece of fiction. It wasn't equational narrative. I'm not a plotter that way. I really tried to um, meet her as honestly as I could every day at a writing desk, and 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 let her go where she was going to go and do what she was going to do.
Is that what led you to the character of Olga? Like, as one cycle of abuse in the film ends in the most violent form for the victim, Krista, another is beginning. We meet this young cellist, Olga, and her youth is really accentuated, Todd. Like, from the way she eats, all the way down to that little toy that she drops in Lydia's car. Was that to kind of play up the power dynamic there? Like, the inappropriateness of Lydia's growing infatuation with her? Talk to me about Olga, Todd.
Well, again, I mean, it's important that you mirror a character, in the same way that this Juilliard character, student Max, is a mirror of her. So is the cellist in a way. The difference in the cellist is, yes, she's 19 years old, she's Russian, um, and there's certain assumptions uh, that Lydia Tar makes about her because she's met a lot of young people that need her, and now she meets a 19-year-old who we've already been able to see one side of Lydia's hypocrisy, a direct violation of the manifesto she lays out for the Juilliard student about being judged by your baton, your stick technique, or something else. Well, that something else apparently has to do with consumer goods, or in this case, green suede boots. So there she is sitting across lunch from this person who um, is literally um, uh, tearing at life, tearing at her food, not concerned about her manners, not concerned about who she's sitting across from, saying she doesn't care who conducted something that was more about Jacqueline Dupre, the player, talking about International Women's Day and Clara Zetkin and people that Lydia Tar isn't even aware of. And suddenly she finds herself in awe of this creature that's not playing by the rules, and is not seemingly so comfortable with herself that she's not constructing an image, which is what Lydia Tar's whole life has been about: presentation, right? Here's a character that doesn't care about anything other than playing the music. So she's the purest form of an artist. She's something to be instantly respected. Um, and 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 in the same way that a lot of, older people sort of feed on the enthusiasms and talents and passion of younger artists in their discipline, she's in the same situation. Of essentially, she's got this muse that suddenly she feels is going to wake her up again. Because who cares about somebody recording Mahler's Fifth Symphony again? Or is it, maybe it'll be great, but will Bernstein's be better? Will Von Karajan's or Abato's, or you name it? Like, and suddenly she has this opportunity that activates her in a way. So that was where the idea came from, which is like, okay, as opposed to what would you say to your younger self? What would you say to your younger self that you might respect more than what you were at that age, where you were following a very clear sort of path of doing sort of understandable, manifest, cultural, educational, accepted doodads to ascend, right? Um, and here's this character who's conducting themselves in an entirely different manner that seems so much more exciting and alive.
Is that what led you to Lydia returning to her family home and watching that tape of What Does Music Mean? Like you mentioned there about how presentation is so important to Lydia. Olga, on the other hand, it's about the music, and she has that raw connection to music that presumably Lydia once had. What did that scene mean to you, Todd, as Lydia kind of reminds herself of, what does music mean? And, we see her break down, we see the mask begin to slip.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you've articulated it quite well. Again, she came from a pre-internet, pre-social media era. And so some of what we learn about her in the beginning is true. Her ethnographic fieldwork, the schools she attended, and some of it is hyperbolic, and some of it is simply wholesale um, fabrication, right? And so this sort of obsession, this sort of fetishizing of Leonard Bernstein is, I think, a very a common thing. There's a reason that many people, myself included, are very fascinated by him as a character, as a human being, as a seducer, and a great, like the greatest advocate ever for concert music, because all you have to do is watch one of his young people's concerts, or watch the unanswered question, or any of the Norton lectures at Harvard, and you think you're going to watch them for 30 seconds, and you find yourself sitting there for hours. There's just something amazing about him as a musician, and and where he stripped away pretense and pulled you into the music for what it was, the essence of
Yeah.
what it was. And so for her to be inspired by that as a young person, and try to run toward that salvation before she was corrupted um, by other forces, and by sitting up top a power structure and having to service that power structure, which is, about legacy and death, and not about creative expression, necessarily, was important. It was also important, for her to remember that, um, and maybe just incidentally important, but not all that important, to realize she never studied with Leonard Bernstein, and she never possibly could have. He died in 1990, and I mean, maybe she would have had a moment to pass him in a hallway, but he certainly wasn't some great mentor to her. And you come across these things, in my business. I've certainly run across people in the past that claim people as mentors, which is why I'm always allergic, even if I've had a mentor, to to characterize them that way, because who's to say who was your mentor and wasn't your mentor? And as far as she's concerned, whatever those videotapes contain at the top of her childhood closet, um, she was mentored by Bernstein. She just never met him, you know.
And we should talk about the ending also, Todd. There's such beautiful symmetry to it. Like, it's a scene that mirrors the opening sequence with Tar strolling out in front of an audience to give this performance. In the beginning, it was an interview. Here she's conducting music from a video game called Monster Hunter. The audience are all in cosplay. On a literal story level, it's an end point to what she probably perceives of herself being a fall from grace. She began the film as this respected bastion of high art, and now she's practically exiled, conducting video game music, which is looked down upon in front of an audience of teenagers in costume. I was wondering whether, the Monster Hunter reference, whether that was a very deliberate choice. The monster, in the context of cancel culture, has been hunted by the end of this film. How did you arrive at this conclusion, this parting shot to the movie?
Well, there are certainly all kinds of ways to look at that scene, and people have, I mean, from her point of view, or let's say not from her point of view, let's say from the world of the milieu of concert music, classical music. Yes, some might see that as a fall from grace. However, Wagner used to underscore every single beat for every gesture of his music. If you look at what the Nazis did to through anti-Semitism to all the great Jewish composers that had to flee Nazi Germany and come out and write the great film scores, invent movie music, and then have Hitler in a bunker sitting there watching those movies and loving those movies. Those composers' music were banned. John Mauceri, who helped me when I was writing the script, just wrote a great book called The War Against Music, or The War on Music, and that's precisely what it's about. And what happened is, after the war, instead of people remembering, oh, it was the reason these composers were banned and kind of kicked out of the classical music club was because of anti-Semitism, instead it just felt like, no, it was just a fact of the great poobah, cultural gatekeepers. So these people many of them were ghettoized and never really accepted back into the classical realm. People, Korngold and Steiner and people like that were some of the great composers of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So, movies were looked at the way that someone in classical music might now think about video games, but no serious person with a straight face will tell you, any modern composer, that they're not composing for video games, because that's the largest audience. And it actually is a huge amount of utility and opportunity in terms of underscoring, if that's your thing, So there's that. And that audience sure looks engaged. There's no one's blinking. I made sure of that, and they've gone to a great deal of effort, just as much as somebody that would, wear swan tails and white ties and pretty dresses to go see concert music in any German Austro sort of venue. So, I think the fundamental difference there, and she's taking it as seriously as anything. I think the fundamental difference for the character there is she's no longer having to run a large organization. As you say, the mask has fallen. And what's she doing? She's taking it as seriously as anything she's ever done. She's making music. She has a human instrument, which is what a conductor plays. And but one fundamental difference, which is that she's been handed a headset. And as she says at the beginning, time is the thing. Time is the great, piece of interpretation. Well, she doesn't have control of time anymore. She's listening to a click track. Right.
That's interesting. And I should ask as well, Todd, whether that conclusion was something you had to pause and really think about, because, well, to whatever degree we accept that this is a fall from grace for Lydia, at least in her eyes, often there is no serious comeuppance. There isn't true accountability for these people in positions of power who behave badly. Were there any other endings you contemplated at any point in the writing process as perhaps thoughts around that crept into your thinking?
No, because I'm not interested in procedurals, and ultimately, if you're dealing with that, that's a different sort of thing. That's not what this film is about. This film, yes, there's a scandal element and there's this examination of power, but it's not some modern day commentary on on anything. It's set in the modern world, so the things that are in the air and part of the conversation are certainly part of her eventual transition into another life. Um, but no, I mean, I would never do that. That's a different kind of movie. That's like a courtroom drama.
Yeah,
It's not,
yeah.
not really my thing.
Well, I should let you go, Todd. But before I do, can I just ask? What's the news with the fundraiser? It's premiering soon. It's a short film described as expanding the Tar universe. Is this something you shot initially as part of the movie, but had to cut for time, and now you're siphoning it off into its own thing? Is it altogether new? And how much should be read into its existence in terms of, I don't know, maybe the possibility of seeing more of Lydia, of returning to this world?
Well, the way that you just described it, I think was came out of the fingers of the or the lips of someone wonderful at the Berlinale Film Festival. They're not my
Yeah.
words, but I'll take them. No, I mean, Kate and I had 9 months before we were on the ground together in Berlin. And over that 9 months, we talked about all sorts of things that we would try, and some of those things we had time to execute. Some of those things we abandoned, and this was a rather extensive idea that both of us were excited about, but kind of dubious that have would ever see the light of day in the film. And we were doubly convinced of that after we'd shot the first part of it, but we decided to finish it anyway. So uh, this is it's a short piece. It's only about 10 minutes long, and it was part of that process. It was part of a lot of things that we tried to play around with, and it's not it kind of lives in a sort of fantasia. It sort of lives in a world apart from the film.
Wow, I can't wait to see it. Well, Todd, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for this film. Good luck in award season, and it's been a pleasure having you on Script Apart.
Yes, I appreciate the conversation, Al. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.